Okay, this is Robert Faust here today, and I'm in Oregon at our headquarters building. And I've talked in the past about the effect of how soils are built, starting with really sterile lava fields, which is research I did in Hawaii because I actually had a farm that was on a lava flow that was had deep histosols or organic soils on it, and we grew tropical fruits, coffee, etc. Okay, so now I'm going to tie that into what happened back in the early 1900s when the what we call the humus theory of plant nutrition was, you might say, overthrown by the work of Justin Liebig, who was a German chemist who did work with plants by analyzing plants for their mineral or their elemental analysis, and then came up with chemical salts, and they could grow plants with strictly with chemical salts in water. Okay, so that's the basis of hydroponics. So when that happened back in Germany, this was the beginning of massive chemical industries where large amounts of ammonium nitrate were being produced. It's used as explosive, it's used in bombs. So there was a lot of production of these things, and there needed to they wanted market share. So if they could overthrow the humus theory, which had prevailed for hundreds of years, and overthrow that and institute the mineral theory or the hydroponic theory of plant nutrition. Okay, let me back up a bit. So the humus theory, which was really the theory up until like the first decade of the 20th century, okay, and that was that decaying plant matter, as it decomposes by microbial activity, it builds up a thick layer of what we call humus, or in German or Dutch turf, or turf in Dutch. And so with the action of the microorganisms producing humic substances, which release minerals from rock, and you have a succession of simple plants up to higher plants, and really that's how it works. Okay, so then you have people like Steiner, who proposed, who's the person behind biodynamic agriculture, which then morphed into organic agriculture. And this was using microbial cultures, what they call biodynamic substances or biodynamic preparations, to produce compost from animal waste, and that was the basis of biodynamic agriculture. It was actually the basis of all agriculture, pretty much, the use of animal waste, compost, etc. When the early hunter-gatherers in Europe crossed, from Eastern Europe or Central Asia into Europe, and they were largely hunter-gatherers, and they started to do a little bit of farming, grains and buckwheat and a few things like that they were producing, and they realized that they could only stay in one location for a few years and the soil would lose productivity. They'd move on. They'd keep moving west to new grounds. And then they got to the point where they were to the Atlantic Ocean, and that's as far as they could go at that point. But at that point, they realized that animal manures were effective at restoring fertility. So they entered into animal-based agriculture, or what we call mixed agriculture, where you have dairy cows eating grass, and goats and sheep and other animals that are producing manure. So you'd grow legume crops like clover, alfalfa, or other legumes to feed your livestock, and then you'd either milk them, you'd produce products from that milk, cheese, butter, etc. And then sheep wool, meat, etc. And so you're producing feed that was frequently legume-based hay, and then maybe grains. But then you end up with a lot of manure, and you could use that on your ground, your gardens, for human food. And then you could maintain a sustainable agricultural production without really slash and burn. So this was an early example of Northern European slash and burn technique that ended with mixed agriculture, use of compost and manures. Okay, so the theory or the concept of humus nutrition developed out of that, because obviously that's what was going on. I mean, you're producing compost, which is humus, you're adding to the soil is being enriched and decomposition, you get earthworms, you're using legumes, which fix nitrogen, which then decompose and slowly release the nitrogen. Okay, now along comes Justin Liebig and chemists in the big cities that they had some chemicals they wanted to sell, so they came up with the mineral theory of nutrition. So they could demonstrate that you could take a series of salts like ammonium nitrate, calcium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, etc., and put it together in the right proportions based on the analysis of plants in the lab they did, and you could grow plants in water and inert media with chemical salts. Okay, so based on that, the fact that you could grow plants that way, they wanted to turn the whole thing around and say, well, you don't need organic matter. We've proved that you don't need humus, you don't need organic matter, because look, we can grow it right in chemical salts. And people were saying, well, that's not true. You can't get as good a results. I mean, farmers knew that you got better results if you use humus, organic matter, manure, etc. There's something missing if it's just chemical salts. But the argument was, this was perpetuated, by universities and publications, and it just got into the worldview. And Liebig's answer to all this, and the academics and the industrialists and everything, was, how could the humus theory possibly be true? Because for that to be true, there would have had to have been plants that died and decomposed, building up humus layer. But how could that happen? That would provide the nutrition for plants. But how could that happen? Because there wasn't any plants. So where did this organic matter and humus come from in the first place? It's not possible. It must have been just mineral nutrition, because there wouldn't have been any humus or organic matter. There's plants. The humus and organic matter came later. Okay, well, that's very simplistic. In other words, it'd be impossible for organic matter to be in humus to be the source of nutrition for plants, because it took plants to begin with to produce that organic matter. So how would they have any nutrition to begin with to even grow and produce organic matter or humus? Okay, so that was the simple story. Okay, now, if we look at lava rock, this is basalt rock. Basalt, various types, ones that cool slowly, have a finer grain than the lava rock that cools rapidly, that has quite a porous structure. Now, this is basalt from Oregon. It's very similar to the basalt in Hawaii. And okay, so how does this really happen? Because we know in Hawaii, for instance, or here in Oregon for that matter, that you have sterile lava flows, you have actually molten rock, and then after 150 or so years, you have a high canopy rainforest, and maybe up to 5 to 6 feet of organic rich soil called histosol, which is almost like peat. And it's very rich in organic matter, and you can grow crops on it, and big trees and all that. Okay, so what's going on? Okay, well, what Justin Liebig and those people promoting chemical agriculture weren't telling you, or they didn't know, is that when you start with lava, which is nearly everything, you get more primitive plants. colonize first. Now in this case here, you'll see lichens. This plant here. Lichen is sort of the precursor of modern plants. It has the properties of algae, it has the property of plants. It can photosynthesize, it can produce substances that etch minerals, its mineral needs from rock, from this lava. And lava varies in its mineral composition. Some areas are richer than others, more balanced than others. And so the effect of enzymes and acids produced by these lichens. Now we have several kinds of lichens here on this lava rock. Now here's an example. Now you'd see lichens like this in Hawaii, but they might be 6 to 8 inches deep on a fairly new lava flow. So you have a warmer climate, you have more moisture, the lichens grow rapidly. So on these rocks here, which are lava rocks from locally, we have a range of lichen species on here, and they are etching away this rock, and they are producing organic matter, and then they decompose. And if these were flat on the ground, they're going to build up organic matter, and then you see higher plants like moss. Here's some moss growing, little green moss. It's like the next stage of plant life. It can photosynthesize, but it needs a little organic matter to get started. It needed the help of these lichens. And then you see a yellow kind of lichen here. So it's a very active component of etching these rocks and releasing minerals from the rock. And so over the years, and not necessarily that many years, if this rock was flat on the ground and it was a high moisture environment, high humidity, higher temperatures, this lichen grows very, very fast, and the rock starts to crumble a little bit, and the dead lichens and mosses start to accumulate, and you have sort of a soil, sort of a peat accumulation. Okay, so the next thing that happens is grasses, brush, a whole range of things can now take root, because birds and winds and everything blowing seed around, organic matter fills these holes, this porosity in these rocks, from dead lichens and mosses and dust, for that matter, from other continents even. And then the seeds are in here, and they germinate, and you get the more evolved plants start to grow, and they break down, they form humus. Fungi and bacteria break them down, form humic substances, and the soils build, and then trees take root, and then you end up with a high canopy rainforest, either here or Hawaii or anywhere, where you have volcanic conditions. This is like the genesis of life on Earth, the minerals in the rock. The more primitive forms of life release those minerals, produce soil on top of those rocks, and then higher plants can take root and grow. So Justin Liebig and those people totally ignored the fact that more primitive plant life was responsible for the buildup of the humus that then nourished the higher level of plant life. See, so that was a convenient thing to ignore that, because it didn't really fit into their story. See, because what they wanted to do was to convince people that you don't need organic matter, you don't need manure, you just need ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, and potassium chloride, and you're good to go. Except you lose soil structure, you lose a lot of the function of the microbes that prevent a lot of compaction in the soil, and more than that, they produce substances we now know that activate genetic pathways that provide resistance to diseases, insects, and pathogens. So it's a complete package. Yeah, you can use hydroponic, you can use chemical salts and grow a plant, but that plant is missing certain organic compounds that provide resistance to disease. And the next